Hi everybody, my name is Karen Fabian and I'm the founder of Bare Bones Yoga, and thanks for taking some time to watch this video. So I want to give a shout out to Teresa, who is a yoga teacher in South Africa, and she wrote me an email actually just this morning, and it was such a good question, and I was actually looking for a topic when I woke up this morning for a YouTube video, so it worked out perfectly. So thank you so much, Teresa, for the inspiration. So her question is one that I'm sure many of you have, and it has to do with the hip positioning in Warrior One. And this is a really good example of how yoga languaging or yoga speak or the jargon of yoga really can shape how we think about the pose, and not in a very good way. And there are a lot of kind of what I call old school cues that have been out there for a long time, and just like the game of telephone, they get passed on from one teacher to another teacher to another teacher to another teacher, and they just like live in forever. And it really, for me, I don't want to say I tend to look at things differently, although I do think because I look at things oftentimes through an anatomical lens, sometimes that informs my cueing and gives me reason to kind of step away from some of those kind of old school cues and talk about things and share things a little differently. So the cue that she was talking about, or that she mentioned, she may not even have known that she was bringing this part up, but her question had to do with the position of the hips in Warrior One. And the word she used is the word that I'm referring to, squaring. So let me stop here and ask you, as you've taught or as you've taken classes, have you heard from the teacher, if you've been practicing, or have you been taught to say, square the hips in Warrior One? And let's think about how kind of nonsensical that is in a way, at least from my perspective it is. So when we say square the hips, what are we talking about? Hips. But what are we literally talking about? Pelvis. Okay? So we're talking about the relationship, well, we can go a little bit deeper. We're talking about the relationship between the pelvis and the femur, and that is the hip joint. Okay? So let's kind of get real technical for a second. However, when we're talking about Warrior One as the shape and the position of the hips, and this idea to square them, we're talking about this whole region here. And you can see, I guess my point is, you can see that there's really nothing square about this part of the body, right? It's circular, it's got a rounded shape to it. Even the hip joint itself is a ball and a socket. There is nothing square about that. So you may think I'm being a little nitpicky here. However, I'm trying to kind of make the point that some of these old school cues are grounded in really an understanding of anatomy that was kind of back in the day, and really has changed the more teachers have become informed about anatomy and more tuned in and sensitive to the languaging piece, right? And this may not be something that you're thinking about. There's a lot to the languaging piece of yoga and what we're communicating when we communicate in a certain way to our students with certain words. And a word like square is definitely going to communicate something different than a word like center. Right? And you can even kind of get a sense of it that center is a much more forgiving, accepting, circular, yogic term, where square is a very harsh, construct, formal, geometric shape. And when you look at this part of the body, to me, it does not communicate harsh, straight lines, box. It just doesn't. It communicates more of rounded, circular, rotation. So let's just kind of put that part out there. And that's a little bit more maybe of the artistic side. So now let's look at the anatomical side. So here we are in Warrior One, and there are some things that are just germane to the shape. There are some things that are just part of the shape. So here the shape is this, right? Where however you're doing it, some variation of this, but it's definitely not this. It's definitely not this, right? So the shape is this. So now let's look at this shape from the perspective of the hips. We want the hips, because the requirement of the pose is to bring the hips more to face the front of the mat or to center the hips. So what this requires is that this front hip be in flexion and a little bit of external rotation. We wouldn't want this hip to be an internal rotation because then we would start to turn this way. So we want to flex, right, not extend, flex the hip and a little bit of external rotation, which basically means we're turning the thigh bone this way, rolling it out. Now this hip is not externally rotating. This hip is internally rotating. If this hip was externally rotating, it would look like this. So here I have external rotation. Here I have internal rotation. And you can see if I turn that back foot out, I externally rotate. Hence the cue, turn the back big toe in. That action at the base creates the internal rotation, activation of muscles like the anterior glute medius, the adductor complex, to create internal rotation through this back hip. Once I create that internal rotation, I start to move the ASIS, the anterior superior iliac spine, to center versus laterally or opening the ASIS, as in Warrior Two. So from an anatomical standpoint, as I turn on my internal rotators of the back hip, which is also an extension, I center this back hip. Now, depending on how much mobility I have in that plane, that transverse plane of internal rotation, I may or may not be able to get this hip forward. And I've heard, recently I was talking to a teacher who said someone, she was taking a class and the teacher classified her as having naughty hips because she couldn't center to the front of the mat. That makes me insane to think that a teacher is using terms like that. It's bad enough that we're saying square, which again, in my view, makes no sense for this part of the body. It's a completely other level of inappropriateness to tell somebody that they have naughty hips, right? We need to kind of appreciate that we can't always know what's happening in the body. We can look at the person, we can see that perhaps they have a bit of a turnout. We can, if we understand the anatomy, assume perhaps those internal rotators are a little bit weak or the external rotators are overactive. All we can do though in that moment without working with that person one-on-one is encourage them through helpful cues to turn that hip forward. And the best way to do it, I'll tell you, is to speak to the bottom of the chain. Sometimes it's hard, almost all of the times it's hard for the person to create the action from here. You have to think of the action as beginning, because it does, at the foot. So as you ask them to turn the back big toe in, squeeze the back thigh, take the inner thigh back, you'll start to create that action of centering the hips. And if you do it in that way, speak from the ground up, you never even need to say center the hips because it's just going to happen, right? If I have someone here and I say turn the back foot in, turn the back foot in more, take the inner thigh back, bend the front knee, squeeze the back thigh, right? I never had to say, now I know what I'm doing, but you get the point. I never had to say center the hips. I could have said that, like a little cherry on top, but it wasn't even necessary. And see, that's where, I don't want to say that's where you want your cues to end up. It's just an example of how some of this, in my opinion, kind of tired phraseology that's out there, yoga jargon-like, really is just a kind of an excuse, kind of a lazy attempt at pretending you know what's really going on. You don't. And many times it is not the fault of the teacher. It is the unfortunate circumstance of how teachers are trained when it comes to cues. If they're trained on the cue without understanding the why behind it, it is impossible to get creative around your expression of the cues if you don't understand what's going on underneath the skin. Furthermore, it's basically impossible, unless you're a good person at faking it, to come across as a confident, knowledgeable teacher when all you're doing is parroting cues. So this is why this approach is so powerful and transformational for teachers and for the students that come to their class. Because now students are not hearing things like square your hips. And let's take the case of a student like this. Square your hips, square your hips. They are not going to be able to do it. But if that's the only tool that yoga teacher has in their tool belt and they don't understand the anatomy, that's all they've got. So here, as we go into understanding the anatomy, the muscles involved, what's really the action, what are the anatomical actions, extension, internal rotation, flexion, external rotation, who's doing that, we can, as teachers, pull from so much more knowledge that can inform a whole variety of cues that we can provide. Very different scenario for us. It's where confidence comes from. It's where making an impact comes from. It's where authentic teaching comes from. And for them, it's where understanding comes for the student and long-term application of that understanding to their practice for the rest of their life. So again, Teresa, thank you so much for the inspiration for this video, and keep questions coming. If you're not in my anatomy work group on Facebook, just go on there, Facebook, and you can just search on Facebook the Bare Bones Yoga Anatomy work group and join that group. And one more thing, if this kind of thing interests you and this whole philosophy of understanding the why behind the cue, I have two ideas for you. I have an ebook on Amazon called Understanding the Why Behind the Cue, and it's my proprietary system for how to do this. It's not so much every single possible cue, it's more the system that I created to understand what would you need to know to understand the why behind the cue. So you can get that on Amazon. And then the other thing is this entire process, my entire approach to helping teachers understand anatomy and figure out how to share the anatomy in their cues is all part of how I train teachers in my signature program, the Blueprint Learning Program. I open enrollment for that several times throughout the year, and you can get on the wait list by going to my website, barebonesyoga.com, and the link is right on the homepage. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Please leave a comment, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next time a new video comes out. Namaste.